2018, the entire world watched in horror as Chris Watts confessed to murdering his pregnant wife Shanann and their two young daughters, Bella and Celeste. He was sentenced to 5 consecutive life terms. No possibility of parole, case closed, or so we thought. Because now, in 2026, there are whispers, legal filings, new arguments being made behind closed doors, and people are asking a question that sounds absolutely unthinkable. Could Chris Watts actually walk free? I know. Just hearing those words feels wrong. It feels like a betrayal of every victim, every grieving parent, every person who watched this case unfold with their stomach in knots. But I need you to stay with me, because the truth is far more complicated than any headline can capture. Stay with me, because this story is far more complicated than the headlines are letting on. And by the end of this video, you're going to have a very different perspective on what justice actually looks like in America, what it costs, who it protects, and why sometimes the most disturbing questions are the ones we absolutely must ask. Let's go back to the beginning, back to August 13th, 2018. Frederick, Colorado, a quiet suburb, the kind of neighborhood where kids ride bikes in the summer and neighbors wave from their driveways. Shanann Watts returns home from a work trip at around 2 a.m. She is 15 weeks pregnant with their third child, a boy they had already named Nico. She had been away for several weeks working for a nutritional supplement company called Lavelle. She was tired. She was excited to be home. She had no idea what was waiting for her. By morning, she, Bella, and Celeste are gone. Chris Watts calls a neighbor, reports them missing. Then he does something that still gives people chills to this day. He gives a tearful television interview, standing right outside the front door of his house, asking the public for help finding his family. You've seen it. We've all seen it. The body language experts, the commentary, the way his eyes moved, the way he talked about his wife and daughters in a tone that felt rehearsed rather than raw, the way the tears never quite came. Investigators were suspicious almost immediately. Within days, surveillance footage, cell phone data, and tracker records placed Chris Watts at a remote oil field site called Survey 319, owned by the energy company Anadarko Petroleum, where he worked as an operator. They searched the site, and that's where they found them. Shanann, buried in a shallow grave not far from the road. Bella and Celeste, submerged inside 2 separate crude oil storage tanks, their small bodies lowered into darkness. The details of what happened inside that house are almost too painful to speak aloud. According to investigators and Chris Watts' own later confessions, and he confessed multiple times with different versions of events each time, he had strangled Shanann in their bedroom, and his daughters, Bella age 4, Celeste age 3. The evidence suggests they were still alive when he put them in his work truck and drove them to that oil field. What happened to those little girls at that site is something that still haunts everyone who worked that case. The arrest came quickly. The evidence was overwhelming. Chris Watts waived extradition and was brought back to Colorado. He sat in front of investigators and eventually, piece by piece, the story came out. Not all at once, not honestly. He initially tried to blame Shanann, claimed he witnessed her harming the girls and acted in a rage. That story collapsed almost immediately under the weight of the physical evidence. The timeline didn't work. The forensics didn't work. Nothing worked except the truth. And the truth was this. Chris Watts had been having an affair with a coworker named Nickel Kessinger. He wanted out of his marriage. He wanted a new life. And rather than face a divorce, rather than face losing half of everything, rather than face the complicated reality of shared custody of 2 children and a third on the way, he made the most monstrous calculation imaginable. He decided his family was an obstacle, and he removed them. Here is where it gets legally complicated. And this is the part that most people, most channels, most coverage gets completely wrong or skips over entirely. Chris Watts never went to trial. Let me say that again because it matters enormously to everything that's happening in 2026. He never went to trial. In November of 2018, just months after the murders, he accepted a plea deal. In exchange for pleading guilty to 9 counts, including 3 counts of first-degree murder after deliberation, 2 counts of first-degree murder of a child, 1 count of unlawful termination of a pregnancy, and several other charges, prosecutors agreed to take the death penalty off the table. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. At the time, this felt like justice. Shanann's family, Frank and Sandy Ruchek, had explicitly stated they did not want to go through a trial. They did not want to sit in a courtroom for weeks or months and relive every detail of what happened to their daughter and grandchildren. They wanted it over. They wanted him behind bars. And he was, for life. But now, in 2026, his legal team is reportedly challenging that plea agreement. And the argument they are making is not simple. It's not a claim of innocence. Nobody is standing up and saying Chris Watts didn't do this. The argument is procedural. It's constitutional. And whether you like it or not, it deserves to be examined seriously. The first prong of the challenge centers on what lawyers call ineffective assistance of counsel, a legal doctrine that says a defendant's Sixth Amendment rights are violated if their attorney fails to provide competent representation. The argument being made is that Watts's original defense team did not fully and properly advise him of all his options before he signed that plea agreement, that he did not fully understand the long-term legal implications of what he was agreeing to, that the advice he received fell below the standard that the Constitution requires. The second prong is even more technically complicated. It involves the interrogation itself, specifically a multi-hour conversation that investigators had with Watts at the Frederick Police Department on August 15, 2018. During that interrogation, Watts eventually confessed. But legal scholars have pointed out that there are questions, serious questions, about whether Watts had invoked his right to counsel at any point during that interrogation, and whether law enforcement continued questioning him after such an invocation. If it can be demonstrated that his constitutional rights were violated during that process, it could affect the admissibility of key statements, and by extension, the validity of the entire plea. Now, and I cannot stress this enough, none of this means Chris Watts is innocent. He is not innocent. He killed his wife, his daughters, and his unborn son. That is not in dispute by anyone, including his own legal team. But the American legal system is built on a foundation that says the process matters. That even the most guilty person on earth is entitled to a constitutionally valid proceeding. And if that proceeding was tainted, if corners were cut, if rights were violated, then the system itself has failed. Not just the defendant, all of us. So the title of this video says, "This is so unfair," and I want to sit with that for a moment, because it is unfair. The question is, unfair to whom? It is unfair to Shanann Watts, a woman who came home exhausted from a work trip, who was growing a new life inside her body, who had no idea her husband had already decided she wasn't going to make it to morning. She deserved better than the husband she had. She deserved better than the end she got. And her family, Frank and Sandy Ruchek, who lost their daughter, their son-in-law, and 3 grandchildren in a single August night, they deserve to never have to think about Chris Watts or his lawyers again. It is unfair to Bella and Celeste, 2 little girls who called their father Daddy and trusted him completely, who had no understanding of adult betrayal or marital collapse, or the kind of cold, calculated evil that lives inside some people. They were 4 and 3 years old. They should be in school right now. They should be fighting over the remote control and eating cereal and asking why the sky is blue. Instead, they are gone, and their father is in a Wisconsin prison filing legal motions. It is unfair to the public, to every person who followed this case, who felt the weight of it, who donated to the Razuchek family, who lit candles, who signed petitions, who felt that for once, the system got it right and locked away a monster. And yet, here is the uncomfortable truth that I think all of us need to sit with, no matter how much we hate it. The constitutional protections that Chris Watts is invoking are the same protections that protect every single one of us. The right to competent legal counsel is not a privilege reserved for people we like. The right not to have your statements coerced or obtained in violation of your rights is not something that only applies to sympathetic defendants. These rights exist precisely because we cannot have a system that applies them selectively, only to the innocent, only to the likable, only to the people the public has decided deserve them. Because the moment we decide that it's okay to cut corners when the defendant is evil enough, we have built a machine that will eventually be turned on someone innocent. History is full of those people. People convicted on coerced confessions. People whose lawyers were incompetent or conflicted, or simply didn't care.